Hi, it's Laura at Aquamarine18. Thanks for stopping by my channel today. I am here with a VR to my friend Casper over at BoyDiviner, and his first tag that he started called hashtag Cardstock Snob. So I will link to Casper's original video below. And this tag doesn't really have a fixed kind of set of questions per se, but in his initial video, Casper talks about some of the different decks that he has that have cardstock that he likes to work with, and also why cardstock is an important part of a deck for him. And so I thought that I would show some decks in my collection. I picked out 7 decks to talk about. I like some of the cardstocks more than others, and I definitely have some preferences. But what I found, I think, is that I'm in some ways a cardstock snob and in some ways not. I definitely, we will see from the decks that I've picked, am kind of cardstock non-monogamous. There's a lot of different types of cardstock that I do like and enjoy, and maybe even like kind of equally as much. But at the same time, cardstock that I don't love can affect how much I work with a deck or whether I purchase a deck. If I really don't think I'll enjoy the cardstock, that can be a deciding factor for me. So maybe that makes me a cardstock snob, or maybe it doesn't. I'm not sure. We'll see. So I thought I would talk about these decks, and I'm going to list the decks that I talk about below with some timestamps, so you can skip ahead if you want. I've also gone around and where I could find the information from deck websites or Kickstarters or wherever, I've included some of the descriptions of the cardstock that I could find, so you have an idea of what it's like. I thought I would start off with a cardstock that I just love, and I love to shuffle and I love to work with, and I think is just quality-wise, so far above and beyond. And I've shown this before, and I've talked about this specifically before in terms of cardstock, and that is the DustIIOnyx Tarot by Corte Alexander. These are the backs. And this is the bigger of 2 sizes that the deck is available in, the travel size, which is on my wish list, and the bigger one. And so I'm not sure if between the travel and this one that the cardstock is identical. So I'm only talking about the version that I have. And this deck has a matte edging on it, which I really like. This is a 350 GSM matte with metallic and holographic foils. So you'll see on the deck, hopefully the camera's picking it up nicely, the titles of the cards and the little lines at the top and bottom there are gold metallic. And in addition to the metallic, there's also these kind of spots of kind of glossiness on the cards. So here in the Ace of Coins, hopefully you can see that the coin there has a kind of texture to it, and I really love this. This deck shuffles really well. It is very soft to hold, but and it is very matte, but it doesn't really stick. Some of these decks with the more rose petal type that it gets talked about as rose petal finish can be really like clump together a lot, and this one doesn't. This deck just shuffles really, really nicely. It's really nice and thick. You hold it and it's just like, this is a really, really well-made deck that's really incredible. And I like those bits of texture. They catch the light a little bit when you read with them, and they just add a little special something, I think, to bring your attention to particular features in the card. Like here, the third eye image on the emerging one, which in this deck is taking the place of the Fool. It just brings our attention to that point on the card, and I really, really love that. So in terms of shuffling and just to hold and to look at this deck, I think that the DustIIOnyx Tarot is really special in terms of its cardstock. I don't have any other deck in my collection like it, even close to like this in terms of cardstock. It's really, to me, I can't get it back in the box. This is a little box that I made so that I can keep the large box, nice. there's really no deck that parallels this one in terms of cardstock for me. I think it's just incredible. Another deck whose cardstock I really like, and the cardstock is also very unique. I think I've never seen another deck with cardstock like this one, is La Corte de Tarocchi. And this is an Il Meneghello deck, and it's by Anna Maria D'Onofrio. And it has the long, thin shape. And I'm not sure about GSM or anything. This deck, on the website that I purchased it through, the cardstock is described as a sturdy matte. I have deck number 288 there. And this deck is so thick. Very matte again. This deck is almost like it's cardboard. Very, very thick. And this is not necessarily a cardstock that I would want all of my decks to have. But I do think that this cardstock that is here, and it's textured as well, really suits the artwork of this deck because it gives them, you know, a kind of antique feel in a way, the texture of that card. And I also think that because of the shape being so narrow, that a thinner cardstock on this deck might make the deck feel flimsy. Like even a thinner cardstock that I might like on some other decks, I feel like with this deck having the shape that it does, you wouldn't want it to be so bendy because the cards would almost then be folded, right? And so, yeah, not necessarily a cardstock I would want every deck to have. It might be very hard to shuffle on a larger deck, but for this particular deck, in terms of its style and its shape, this really thick cardboardy stock I really like. Again, it shuffles well. It doesn't clump or stick. I have pretty big reach, so shuffling like lengthwise, I can hold this deck lengthwise and shuffle. I know the lengthwise shuffle on the long cards is not always something people prefer to do, but I do, and it shuffles well for me. So that's the sturdy matte of La Corte de Tarocchi. But in addition to sturdy matte and the 350 GSM matte, I also like linen cardstock. So this is the Journey Oracle by Kelly Fitzgerald of The Truth and Story. And this is a professional casino linen cardstock, black core. And so you can see, hopefully, the texture of the linen stock there. And I have a handful of linen cardstock decks in my collection. And of course, the linen, you know, in this case it says, you know, professional casino. It feels like a good playing card deck, right? Which is perfect because playing card decks are made to be, you know, shuffled and shuffled and shuffled and shuffled, right? And so I think linen cardstock shuffles really well. It goes really smoothly. Again, no clumping together, no sticking. This is a bit of a tricky shuffle because of the shape, but I'm getting better at it. And I always, of course, overhand shuffle. You will be able to tell from the decks so far. I'm not a riffler, though I think that when it comes to cardstock snobbery and cardstock preferences, definitely shuffle style is going to affect this. I know that, at least from what I've seen, folks who riffle shuffle always seem to maybe prefer that the cardstock not be quite so thick because it's harder to bend into the riffle shuffle, right? But I don't riffle shuffle, so I love if they're very thick. But these ones are not, but they shuffle wonderfully. I'm a big fan of the linen cardstock. So that's the Journey Oracle by Kelly Fitzgerald, another deck whose cardstock I love. A deck that I'm pretty sure has come up in several people's responses that has excellent cardstock as well is Benabel Wen's Spirit Keepers Tarot. This one is the Vitruvian Edition that I have here to show, and I have some of the extra goodies on top, like the book. There we go. This one has a metallic edging there, or gilding, and this cardstock is 350 GSM in an absolute matte, is the language that's used on Annabelle's website. So it feels very, very smooth. There's a bit of a shine, like when you see the light hit it, but it's not glossy at all. And it just feels so nice. It shuffles so well. And again, something that I find with some decks is that decks with this metallic edging for me, sometimes the metallic edging is sticky and the cards will clump. And with the Spirit Keepers, it has the beautiful metallic edging, but without the cards sticking to each other. And it just, this deck, you know, part of this kind of shuffling is like a tactile experience, right? Like what it feels like. But it sounds, I don't know if you can hear it, when they slide together, it is such a nice, you know, papery sound. Amazing. Spirit Keepers Tarot. Out of print, so be jealous, but excellent cardstock. I love the cardstock on this deck. And just an aside, now that I'm thinking about it, because I have the box out, each of the decks came with a name, which is pretty fun. So, absolute matte. So far I've shown matte and linen. Next I have definitely what is called the rose petal finish, and this is the Soul Cards Tarot deck by Christine Fredheim, Karina Nika, and Eva Eklund. Hopefully I've said all of those names right. And it actually has a kind of rose petals right on the deck, right? It's like a little reference to the cardstock. This one also has the matte gilding that I prefer. And some of these I do find, you know, don't slide very nicely. This one with the rose petal finish does shuffle quite well. I was pleasantly surprised actually with this one. There's a tad bit of stickiness, but with a lot of shuffling, I've found that it's mostly gone away. I will say one thing in terms of cardstock that this deck, you know, that I don't love, and it's something, you know, to perhaps consider with the cardstock, is that with the black rose petal in the case of this deck, I find that, you know, you're probably not going to be able to see it on camera, but it's really, really fingerprinty. So it really shows. I mean, they go away if you give them a little bit of a wipe, but the black matte does seem to pick up quite a bit of fingerprint. Not a great feature in my opinion, but it shuffles beautifully. So I do love that, because when I'm thinking about cardstock, I'm mostly thinking of shuffling experience. So every deck that I've shown so far is matte. I would count the linen cardstock as matte as well, because it's not shiny. Maybe linen is kind of a third category, I don't know. So clearly I have a preference for more matte finished decks as opposed to glossy. My struggle with glossy, I know people find that the glossy ones don't photograph necessarily as well. It's hard to not get a light reflection on it. That doesn't bother me so much, but what I generally don't prefer about a lot of the glossy decks is the sticking. I find that they cling, and then also the other problem with some of the glossy decks in my collection is that the edges start to kind of fray. Like if the gloss starts to kind of chip off the edges look not very nice after a while. But I do have some glossy cardstock that I love, including the cardstock for the Prisma Visions Tarot by James R. Eads. This is very definitely glossy. It has the shiny silver gilding, and you can see the gloss. Like, these are really glossy cards. But somehow these cards do not stick to each other. They don't clump up. They shuffle really smoothly, really easily. I feel like I'm always getting a good shuffle from these cards. So I do know that glossy cardstock that I love is possible. Despite glossy, you know, if I had to sum up my preferences not being my preference, it is possible to have a glossy cardstock that I experience as a good shuffling deck. So that's the Prisma Visions by James R. Eads. I know that, I believe that for his other deck, the Light Visions, the purpley version of this one, I think may now actually be available in a more matte option. I have the same cardstock for that deck as well, so it's also the gloss. But in these decks, I quite like the gloss, so it's fine with me. The last deck I have to show is closer to kind of a mass market matte cardstock, and that's the Margarete Petersen Tarot. And there's a couple of versions of this. I have the one that I think's the more like easy to find one from what I've seen, which is the AGM Urania printing of this deck. I like the matte finish of these cards. My deck is in order right now. They have that little bit of reflectiveness, but they're very matte. What I would say for cardstock that I don't love in terms of this deck is that it is thin. So the decks that I've shown that are, cardstock that I love tend to be quite thick. I want to feel like a deck is really sturdy, and I don't have the riffle shuffle consideration, the need to bend the cards. Like, I don't want to bend my cards. So I like a cardstock to be thick. These are not. However, again, I think that for me, what kind of cardstock I would be looking for, or what kind of cardstock I would prefer, is really, really deck dependent. So similarly with the La Corte de Tarocchi, I had mentioned, I wouldn't necessarily want all my decks to be this thick, but because of the narrow shape of the card, it gives it some weight that otherwise it could feel flimsy. I feel like kind of the opposite is true with this deck. These cards are huge, right? And I think that with a stock that was really thick on these cards, they would be very hard to shuffle, even for me and my big hands that can shuffle it lengthwise. If this deck was, twice the thickness, shuffling it would be impossible. So insofar as I'm going to get a deck that's really big, and I'm thinking of this deck, but also even the mass market Next World Tarot, for example, is also quite large, similar size to this, and also has a similarly, thinner matte cardstock. On decks that are really big like this, I actually don't mind a thin cardstock. On other decks, I might not like this. I would say, oh, it's flimsy, I don't like it. But on the big cards, it works for me because it makes them easy to handle and easier to shuffle lengthways, which is the way that I like. So I'm not sure if I'm a cardstock snob at the end of this 18-minute VR. I like a range of cardstocks, and for me, which cardstock is ideal in my opinion, and of course it's all opinion, I recognize, not everybody's going to have the same preferences as me. My cardstock preferences are shaped by the fact that I overhand shuffle, and really are deck dependent on the size of the deck, the shape of the cards, the number of cards in the deck. When we start thinking about oracle decks and things like that, I have an oracle deck that has 100 cards in it. I wouldn't want those cards to be La Corte de Tarocchi thick, or I would never fit the deck in my hand, right? So it comes down to, for me, shuffling style and the kind of dimensions and style of the deck as well when it comes to what kind of cardstock that I like. So that's my ramble about the cardstocks in my collection. I've been interested in seeing what other folks' preferences for cardstocks are. I know that it's, always a topic of contention and conversation when a new deck comes out that, is the cardstock, good or bad? But I think it's really just down to, preference at the end of the day. So that's what I look for. Let me know your thoughts on cardstock in the comments in general, or if you have any of the decks that I've mentioned, I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day. Bye.